Anyway, I did post something over the last week. You may have seen it in the Discord chat about J Center and it going into sunset.
Yeah, I saw that. What does that mean? I mean, without
So
getting into it.
yeah, it's one of the places where their dependencies are being downloaded from. So we've got Gradle as our build system. It pulls the dependencies from something called Maven, which is used for just general both Android and Java dependencies, kind of like npm. Um, so there's a few different repositories of those packages that are out there online. If you were using Node, we just used npm, and that was our repo. But in the Java world, there's a few different ones that are out there. Google has their own repository, which only basically Google developers can put stuff up to. There's another one called JCenter, and those two are the ones that are brought in and included by default when you create a new project in Android Studio. Is the Google repository and the JCenter repository. Well, what's happening is that the JCenter, the people behind JCenter, have decided to sunset that repository. So it's going away in the next 12 months. But in terms of encouraging people and making sure people are aware of it, they've decided to do a brownout on it on the 12th and the 26th of this month. And if you kind of look at the calendar, that lands on next Monday, and then 2 weeks from there. So what that means is they're planning to take the JCenter repository down for a few hours on both of those days, so that people can kind of see, hey, what am I going to do when this eventually goes away, and encouraging projects to take the chance to migrate. So doing so, I found out about this over the spring break, reading up on a few different things, and so it I haven't really seen a time when they're planning to do the brownout. It might be just in the morning, in which case it really won't affect us much. But if it does end up being in the afternoon, then it may mean that there's a period of time where you effectively may not be able to use Android Studio. Does that follow?
Yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
realize it was downloading dependencies every time we built our applications.
Yeah. It downloads the dependencies in two cases. It downloads the dependency anytime you hit sync, anytime you sync the Gradle file, or make a change. You usually make a change to the Gradle file and sync it. It also downloads the dependencies every time you open the project. So as long as you have the project open and already working, it you should be able to continue working. But the problem is if you don't have the project open when the server goes offline, or if you need to restart Android Studio at such, then you may not be able to run the project during that
So how
period
would
of
we
time.
do that? Like if it's during class, would we just take that time to do a lecture or something?
Yeah, we'll figure out what the plan there is. We may do lecture is one way, is to go over some theory, and we'll just kind of have to play it by ear. Hopefully they'll have the problem solved, and or there'll be a workaround by then. But yeah, if not, then we'll alter our plans accordingly. Cool. So if you see your build stop working on the 12th, then that's what's up, and get in touch with me, and we'll figure out what we're gonna do from there. Cool.
All right.
So it makes it even in terms of doing a lecture, it makes it hard to do a lecture with an actual application. We can do some theory, but it makes it hard to do a lecture with an application if I can't run the project through Android Studio. So we'll see. The plan is to migrate the stuff on JCenter over to Maven Central. So there's another repo that will replace it. So the hope is that you're going to be able to just make a quick change to your Gradle files from here on out, and be able to navigate through it that way. But at least from my testing, that doesn't work yet. There's one thing from Android Studio, the one package that JetBrains needs that they haven't migrated over to Maven Central yet. So if they do that, then we should be good. Okay.
All right.
So long way around that, but yeah, we're just gonna have to play that by ear on Monday and see how it goes. But hopefully that there'll be a workaround before then. I just haven't seen anything yet. So today we're going to be talking about Picasso, which is a tool for kind of downloading and caching images. It's a very popular tool. In fact, it's made by a company called Square, which you might have heard of. They do a lot of point of service, point of sale sort of software, as well as e-commerce sort of tools. So they've had a hand in building this tool called Picasso. So it's one of there are a few different things you can use for downloading images and putting them into your apps when you want to download them from the internet specifically. Picasso is one of them. Glide is another one that's also very popular, and there's a few others out there that you can use as well. But the only one we'll be covering here today, at least in this course, is going to be Picasso. Cool. I will say this will probably be my shortest lecture all semester, because Picasso is actually ridiculously easy to use.
Music to my ears after spring break.
Ridiculously easy to use. So my slides are I've got about 6 slides. That's really the whole lecture. And it's really just one line of code when you get down to it. So it's actually super, super easy. And this is, one of the great things about Picasso is just it's so much easier and so much more efficient than trying to build all this stuff yourself that, why not use it, because it's going to make a lot of that easy. And as it turns out, basically any app you build, you're going to at some point find that you need to download some images from the internet. So this is something that factors into basically every app you build. So it's a just generally useful technique. Okay. So if you're looking on Perusal, I posted a few things up there, all with, at least I moved them to a due date of this Friday. So they're up there. So you've got the Picasso documentation, which I put up there. You've also got the slides for today. And then what we'll talk about Wednesday, we'll talk about volley. So that's up here as well. I had originally planned to talk about 9.0 today. Honestly, I forgot and planned for the Picasso lesson, so I'll just have to push that probably off to next week, so we can talk about that. Another thing I want to mention quick, I forgot to mention on the calendar, is I will be out this Friday, taking a vacation with the wife. We have not been out of town in a year, to kind of take a weekend vacation, so we're taking that this Friday. So Evan will be covering, then he'll be sitting around, but it'll be a lab day. Okay, so if you want to follow along, the slides are up there on Perusal. I've got them pulled down locally here, so I'll be reading them off, going through them here. Let me go to view, and I want to go to slideshow.
And no relation to Picasso. That's or is that just a coincidence? The name.
No relationship to what?
It was a Google Photo Manager.
Oh.
I think they sunsetted that like 8 years ago or something.
No relationship to that. No. Yeah, I think that got replaced by Google Photos. I actually did really like that, but they, yeah. Okay, so Picasso is what we're talking about here. Can everybody see my slides, see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I got my recording going, so that's good. So objectives today, it's actually really simple. We're going to talk about how to load images from the web using this tool called Picasso. Picasso is not a part of the Android operating system or the Android SDK itself. It is a third-party dependency. So take that with a grain of salt and understand what that is. But that's not really a big deal. It's very, very common, especially as you saw with Node, for us to use tools that have been built by all sorts of third parties to roll into our software. So what is Picasso? So Picasso is an image downloading and caching library for Android. Part of that caching part is actually really important because it will actually save the files temporarily in memory so that you can come back and look at it later without having to necessarily always download all the files again. There's a limit to that cache, so you will see that there are images, as we say, if we put it in recycler view, you're going to see it downloading it again if you scroll down and scroll back up. But it does do some caching in there, which can be very helpful. It's created by Square, which, as I mentioned previously, kind of in the intro to this, is the same company that does your little square pucks that you'll see at the cash registers and such. This is not the only thing that Square has made, and they've actually made some of the. I have to say, Picasso's been one of the best contributors as far as libraries go to Android. So we'll actually be talking about another one of their libraries next week called Retrofit, which is also by Square. So they've been kind of in that game for a while. The first release of Picasso was around 2013, so this library's been around and in existence for 7+ years now. So it's a pretty mature library. Version 2.8 was just released in 2020, so they've been continuously improving on that, and there's been a lot of things that have they fixed and improved over the years.
Hey, Mr. Smith,
Yep.
Isn't Square based here in St. Louis?
I don't know. I thought they were based in California, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
I think it was created here. My old boss, actually knew the person who made it.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up, that's kind of interesting, but as a possible place of employment for us, I mean, why not? It's right here, and they do cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if they're hiring, then that's a great place to apply and see what they have open. I just looking at their homepage, I don't see where their home office is.
It's in California, but the owner of Square used to live in St. Louis. He went to the Berg.
Okay. Yeah, they're out in San Francisco now. So yeah. So that's Picasso. The basic usage of Picasso is actually super, super easy. In terms of getting an image to load, it's really just one line of code typically. So what you write is you say Picasso.get. So that first part will give you an instance of Picasso. It's kind of built as a singleton sort of library. So that gives you that single instance. Then you're going to call load. And from there, you're going to pass in wherever your URL is for that image. So usually you're going to pull that from some sort of REST API or wherever you get that data. You just put it in there and say, hey, here's the URL for the image you want it to load, and you say into my image view. And that's basically it. You say, pull it from this URL, put it in this image view. And you're for the most part, at least in a simple usage, that's all you need to do. Right? That is, the main part of Picasso is that one line of code. In reality, there's a few more things you want to do in order to provide a better user experience and to avoid the application crashing, because there's a lot of ways that if you build it this way, just those 3 method calls, that this can crash. One of those is, this crashes if the URL is null, so you do have to check for that. It also can crash if the image is too large. So if you're pulling down 4K images, very quickly your Android device will run out of memory. So one of the things you have to do is you also have to tell it to resize the images as you're downloading it, so you're not running and using up all that memory. And another thing you often want to do is put some placeholders in there that it can show while the image is downloading, so the user has some kind of indication that the image is being downloaded, that's in the progress, that's in process of doing that. And you also generally want to have an image as well to show if there's, say, an error in downloading the image. So there are often, some placeholder images you want to put in, as well as just, being able to resize and things like that. So there's some additional considerations around this that we need to look at. So in terms of checking that it's null, generally speaking, all I would do there is I would say, well, is that image URL null? If it's null, then I'm just going to directly put my placeholder into that image view. So I do just like we've seen before, image view dot, if there's not an image URL, I would just say image view dot set resource, set drawable resource, and that would provide the image that I have. So I want to have one that's bundled. One of the mistakes that a lot of people make in terms of dealing with a null URL is they say, well, if there's a null URL, let me use this other URL to a placeholder image. Well, the problem is the most common place where you run into some of these things where you need the placeholder is often going to be when you don't have an internet connection. So whatever you're using as a placeholder image needs to be something that isn't on the internet but is bundled with your application, and specifically is in the drawable folder. Is everybody with me there?
Yep.
So you want to provide, you want to check that image URL is there. If it's null, then use a drawable instead to load it, as we've done before. So for the other placeholders, not the cases where the URL is null, there's two additional methods that you want to add into this call chain. So one of those is to call the placeholder method. So in here I'm going to say placeholder and set it to whatever image I want to use while it's downloading. So while the image is downloading, it'll be showing this IC downloading instead. And then if something goes wrong, if we fail to download the image, I want to tell it to show something else. So here I'm going to call the error method and say rdrawable IC error. In this case, I've used icons, vector assets that I just got through the Vector Asset Studio and Android Studio, but you can really use any sort of image that you have. It just needs to be something that is an embedded resource in the app and not something that's a URL to another file. So that's how you set up the placeholders. You're going to check, first of all, is the image URL null? Do what you need to do there. And if it's not, then you can proceed with this and put those two placeholders in. So those are an important thing to do. Otherwise, if you don't include both of those methods, placeholder and error, then what the user will see as the image is downloading, or if it fails to download, they'll just see a blank area in the content, and they'll think that your app is broken or the app is still downloading. You definitely want to give the user some indication about what's going on, and that's how you do that. In terms of resizing the image, that's also very simple. The first thing you need to do is call the resize method. And so this resize method says, I want to resize it to this size or smaller. It will automatically deal with the idea of keeping the same, preserving the aspect ratio, so you don't have to worry about that. I don't have to say, if the image is 16 by 9, then set it to this. If it's 8.5 by 11 or whatever, whatever your 4 by 3, wherever your dimension constraints are, you don't have to build that in here. You can, but as far as resizing, you're going to use a generic number that's not based on the actual size of the image. It is useful if you have control over the original images to resize them so they basically all have the same aspect ratio. That is useful, but you don't have to, this is not saying that will it be exactly 1,000 by 1,000. What you're saying is I want the width of the image to be 1,000 pixels or less, and I want the height to be 1,000 pixels or less. And so it'll keep the aspect ratios when it resizes that. That's really important, again, because I mentioned a number of services do provide very large images, whether it be 4K images or even 2K images. That can very quickly cause your application to run out of memory, which is anywhere from 2 to 4 of those images can mean that your entire app crashes because it can't do anything else. So you want to make sure that anytime you're using Picasso, always use resize in some way, shape, or form.
Why would you would never want to use 4K for Android or a phone or a tablet? That's just way too big.
Pretty much not. There are exceptions to that rule. If you're looking, let's say you have an e-commerce app and you have one page that is like the product list and another page is like the product detail page. So on the product list, you obviously don't want to display 4K images, right? That's way too big for the product list. But if I'm looking at the details of an app, I might actually want to show that 4K image. Might be possible. But I can really only have one of those, is my point. If I'm going to do 4K, at most, I have enough memory for one of those. I wouldn't assume that your device has memory for 2, for sure. It also depends a little bit on how big your device is, right? So if you have a 10-inch tablet, you might actually have enough resolution to justify showing a 4K image there. Does that make sense? Although 4K resolution on Android devices is still very, very rare. 1920 by 1080 is still kind of usually good enough for most things. Usually the kind of upper bound. Cool.
A lot of higher-end phones have 1440p displays these days.
Yeah. But that's still not quite up to 4K, which would be 4,000 wide, if I remember right. It's about 3,648 or something like that is the width of it. So that's like double that high-end range of 1,400. It's more than double. So I know that even from, remember we did the hands-on test and we were working with the NPR news stories. I know from past experience that sometimes that feed itself, sometimes the images that they provide in that feed are 4K images, believe it or not, and that can be that's part of where I saw that come up. So you want to resize them to whatever makes sense. Honestly, it really depends on the layout of your device. 1,000 by 1,000 is usually a pretty good benchmark. Somewhere, in there for, at least my experience was, around there for displaying things in a list. But again, you're going to have to do some actual testing to figure out what those numbers are for you. But here I'm hard coding them, by the way, as strictly that number, which also means that because I'm hard coding them as 1,000, that means that regardless of what the size of the screen is or all those other things, that it's just gonna use the same number, which oftentimes doesn't work for all screen sizes. So we usually need to be a little bit more dynamic. The next method that you see in there right below the resize is I'm calling center inside. And what that will do is it will say, we'll take, you have to, the order of these does matter. So center inside does have to be called after resize. You cannot call it before. But it says then, okay, you wanted me to resize it to 1,000 by 1,000. All right, when I resize that, I'm going to resize it so that it's centered inside of that 1,000 by 1,000 block. So if that means that I need to add black bars to the left and right, then I'll do that. If I need to add black bars to top and bottom, I'll do that instead. So that's one of the things that you want to put in there as well, is center inside. There's also another method which you'll see in the documentation called center crop. Center crop instead says rather than adding bars on the left and right or bars on the top and bottom, that it will instead crop it down so that you're losing either the top or the bottom of the image or losing the left and right of the image. You can play around with that. My experience with kind of doing that in a sample space is that actually didn't work very well for me. I would say that the center inside is probably the better of those two to pick, but you can play around with that depending on what may work better for you. It's going to either be center inside or center crop. But you'll want to use either one of those when you build your applications. Questions on that?
No, it's pretty straightforward.
So this is still, we're talking about this whole thing here. We're still talking about one line of code, right? It may be spread across multiple lines. I'm just doing that for readability sake. But if you kind of look at how this code is written, that's really still just one very long line of code, is all what we're looking at. Now, one of the things I mentioned on the previous slide is that those were fixed dimensions. I said 1,000 by 1,000. That may work for some cases, and depending on your app, it may actually work for all cases. But what I would say is typically what you're going to find is you need something that's configurable and changeable based on the size of the screen. And so one of the things that we've talked about previously is how to use a dimens.xml file to do some of that. To say, if the screen is 600 pixels or wider, then 600 dp or wider, then let's use these numbers instead. Or if it's 900 dp or wider, use these numbers, or 1200 dp or wider, we did that by using different variants of the dimens.xml. And you remember we did that with like the grid layout. The grid layout that we use with the recycler view was one of the places that you saw that. So we can kind of use that technique here to also make this configurable so that we can have it resizing to different sizes based on either the size of the screen or the density of the screen. Because both of those can have a factor as to what number looks good and what number makes it, reduces the memory footprint, but also because you're trying to make the image smaller to reduce the memory footprint, but you also don't want it to be so small that the images go to be blurry. So for instance, if you say, I'm going to resize all of the images to 50 by 50, probably on some screen you're going to find that they're a blurry mess. So that's usually something that you need to change. So in order to facilitate all that, what I want to do is I want to extract those values, put them in dimens.xml in the different variants that I need. And obviously there they will be measured in dp instead of being measured in pixels. But I'm going to set up this image size as a dimens resource and then just provide that to resize dimen instead of what we saw here, which was resize. So instead of calling resize, I'm going to call resize dimen, give it a dimension resource. So that's a tremendously useful thing and definitely something you should do as you're building it out. Interestingly enough, unfortunately, this method's not mentioned in the documentation. Go figure. But it is strong. I would strongly recommend you use resize dimen over resize for the reasons we just talked about. Okay. So that way you can have different variants of it depending on what the size of the screen is. You can read more about Picasso at two places. You can go to the official tutorial, which is on their page. So if you go follow to their official tutorial, you'll get to something that looks like this, and that will walk you through some details of how to do it. And then another resource that you can look at as well is you can actually go to the GitHub repo for the project. And that has some information here as well about how to use it and some of the other things that are there. So those are your kind of main go-tos in terms of reading more about Picasso. Any questions?
Nope.
So I'll show you a quick code example of how you can use this. I won't be providing the actual code for it, but I'll show you how it kind of works out and some of the things that you need to do in terms of setting it up. So let me pull this up. So what I've done is I've gone through the NPR Tech News app, which that we made just the week before spring. You made this as the hands-on test. And what I've done is I've added images to it. I want to run that on not the 10-inch tablet, but the Nexus S. And I may need to restart this project. So we've got the list of news stories, and so what I've done is I've added the image here to the top of each story. And what you'll see as the start downloading. Now that seems interesting because I do not see my download happening there. So let me kill the device real quick just to make sure I'm starting fresh. So AVD manager, I'm gonna go here and we're gonna wipe the data for that emulator, and so we can start clean. So that's going to take a minute to reboot. So things that I had to do in order to get it in there. Obviously, I had to add an image view to the item layout. So that's one of the things you'll need to do as well for the lab, is add an image view in there. It's taking its sweet time to load. So I've got an image view up at the top. Other things you'll want to do, you'll want to probably give that some amends as well for the dimensions of it. So for instance, in here I have the width and the height as two resources. So you can see this refers to the width and the height of it are at dimen. Go back to code. At dimen item story image width, at dimen item story image height. So those are both things I can configure on a per device basis using dimensions. I'm also using another resource, another thing in there, which is the resize, which is a third value. So if I look at what's in my dimens.xml file, these are the three things that I've added to it to make this work. So I've got what is the width of the image view, what is the height of the image view, but I've also got a number here that I'm using for the resize. So the width of it is 0 dp or match constraints. I'm constraining the height of the image to 100 dp, so all of these images will come in at 100 dp in height, at least for the smaller devices, for mobile devices, the phones. And I'm also resizing it to 1000 dp. Now you'll notice that I'm using a higher number here for that resize than the actual dimension of the actual height of the image, the height or the width of the image. That's intentional because at least in my testing I found out if I use the same number as what it's being displayed at, I found that the number that image comes in very blurry. So I had to kind of bump that up until it worked. So that's kind of how I'm configuring those values. So what you should be seeing is there's kind of you see as I get there, as I scroll down, you can see how the image kind of fades in. And I can scroll down further and you'll see as it kind of gets to that point, the image starts downloading. Now I'm not seeing it show my downloading or my error icons. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. I think that may have to do with the way I'm setting the aspect ratio, because I think that was working at some point, and then I changed a setting and it stopped being displayed properly. So that's kind of the gist of that. And if I go back up to the top of the list, you'll see it downloading those here again where it fades back in. So that's kind of what Picasso does. In terms of how I'm setting this up, where we usually bind all this data, where do we usually say we'll make this the title of the story and the body of the story? Where do I make those things show up? Where in the code have we done that before? What class?
I just think of it in the method of on bind.
Mm-hmm. And Troy, you said the adapter, which is right. So the code that's new here is basically it's in the story list adapter. And so what I do is I first get the image from the story. I'm going to say, well, if the image URL is not null, right? If there is an image there, then we're going to go ahead and make the image visible and use Picasso to load it in. So we're going to say Picasso.load placeholder error that resize dimension center and size into. So the same stuff that we saw in the slides. So I'm basically calling that in that case. And if something goes wrong and if there's not an image there, what I'm actually just doing is I'm just making it invisible. So you can either do that as making the image invisible with gone, or you can do that as using another placeholder. The two placeholders here that I'm using, IC downloading, IC error, those are over here as files, IC downloading, IC error. Those I brought in using the vector assets that are built in. So if you go new vector asset, that first one, if you just look for downloading, that's the one that I pulled there. The other one you can just find by looking for error. So that's where you can find those icons, should you want to use those as well. So that's how I bring those in. But the main part of this is really, that's really the whole code of as far as using Picasso, at least in a recycler view case, which is the most common one. Any questions?
Up at the top.
Yep.
So line 112 would normally just throw an error, right? So you have to bring that in. How did you do that?
Right. So I said Picasso.get is what you'd want to put here. What I'm actually doing, so I don't have to get Picasso more than once, is I declared it as a variable here, and I'm calling Picasso get in the constructor. And that's just a slight performance boost. So I'm not calling Picasso.get constantly in on bind view, but you can write it as Picasso get as well.
That's enough right there, or did you have to? I'm having trouble coming up with how I want to ask my question, but it doesn't auto import. Do you have to manually type it since that's third party?
In the Gradle, so what you need to add is this, and I think I did not post this on I don't think this was on the slides, but it is in the reading assignment. So you do have to add into your Gradle. You have to add a dependency for Picasso. Cool. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, that's it. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's really it as far as the looking at how this fits in. Usually you're going to end up using Picasso on more than one screen. In this case, we only have one screen in this app, so I'm just seeing it here in the recycler view. But usually I'm going to have this set up in such a way that I click on a thing, and that gives me, say, a detail page for that. But in this case, when I click on the URL, it doesn't take me to another screen in the app. It takes me to my web browser. Okay. So that's how that's set up. Talking about your lab assignment, because you've got a lab assignment then to work on related to this today and tomorrow. So if you look under inside Ranken, you look under the Unit 5, which is where we are now, you should find the Unit 5 lab worksheet, which is this. So what you've got in terms of the lab assignment, you can go to, you've got two options to choose from. You can either kind of do what I just showed, which is, add the images to your NPR Tech News app that you built right before spring break, or you can go to your the project you're working on for your lesson 7 and 8 labs that connects to a REST API and put images in there. I will take either of those as your lab project. Questions?
Trying to remember what we were doing for lessons 7 and 8 now. It's all foggy.
So remember, we started out with async task. So we were talking about async task. We talked about broadcasts and broadcast receivers, especially the local broadcast. We talked about connecting to the internet and using the, remember, HTTP URL connection to download stuff. Pull down JSON. We did some stuff with JSON to parse it as well.
Oh, like the weather thing I did.
Yeah, the weather thing would be what you did. So if your weather thing has images, which, if your weather forecast has images with it, then, hey, you can use Picasso to bring those images in. If not, then you're going to go here if your REST API doesn't provide images, which a lot of them do, not all, but on all of them do, which is why I'm providing two options, because I know that the NPR endpoint does have images.
All right, pretty simple. So we're going to be tying this into our apps for our final project.
Yes, that is the expectation. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the expectation, that Picasso is one of the things that you should be using in your final.
I'm trying to think like how that would work if me doing the restaurant menu.
Mm-hmm. Well, what it means that your images would be hosted online, which really is where your data should be, right? If you're talking about, you're building out a menu, well, that menu should be, at some point, should be hosted online. Does that make sense? Which means that then those images should be accessible through a URL, right?
Okay.
Once they've been uploaded, they should be accessible through a URL.
The other technologies like Volley and I can't remember the other ones, that's where they're going to be hosted, or is there some other place?
So what we'll talk about on Wednesday is another library called Volley. And Volley is basically provides a way to do HTTP requests in a much more user-friendly way than using the HTTP URL connection class that we've done so far. So it provides a lot of kind of extraction over that, as well as some additional performance benefits and readability benefits. Gets rid of a lot of the boilerplate code that we've been writing up until this point with the last 2 weeks of class.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Yep. So Volley will tie in with that as far as that goes, because you'll effectively be using Volley or Retrofit to upload the images, and then you'll be using Picasso to download the images.
Okay. What else are we doing today? So we just work on the lab for the rest of the time.
Just work
and
on the
turn that
lab
in,
for the rest of the
reading
time for
assignments and that.
today. One of the things that we need to do tomorrow is I need to discuss with people what your final project proposals are and kind of get you started on the first draft. So I'll be talking with people one-on-one tomorrow about that. But today, the rest of the day would just be to work on the lab assignment. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah. Okay. Good deal. All right. Cool.
Okay.
We'll just work on it, and then you'll be available for questions and all that.
Yep.
Okay.
And there's your reading assignments on. You've got the reading assignment on perusal to help give you some more information to be able to look at that. So definitely take a chance to look at the Picasso reading assignment as well as putting your comments on it.
Okay. All right.
So
Thanks.
no problem. So I'll be around. Just get in touch with me as you have questions. But lab day, labs for the rest of the day.